It was a crisp morning on the farm, the kind of peaceful, quiet morning that wrapped the protagonist in comfort like a familiar worn blanket. Birds sang from the trees, the barn stood proudly on the hill, and the only noise was the occasional bleat of the goats grazing lazily in the pasture. The protagonist, a private soul, had built their life here to escape the hustle and bustle of the world. For years, the land had been their sanctuary, a place where they could tend to their animals and bask in the simplicity of nature. But that tranquility was shattered the moment Karen appeared. Karen was the kind of neighbor who had no sense of boundaries. Her confidence, or perhaps arrogance, seemed to fill the air before she even spoke. She strolled up the gravel driveway, heels clicking with an annoyingly deliberate rhythm. The protagonist saw her coming from the porch and felt a chill of dread settle in their chest. They knew it was only a matter of time before Karen would push their patience too far. As Karen approached, her smile was too wide, too calculated, one of those smiles that could mean either good news or impending disaster. She waved her hand as if she owned the place, and the protagonist braced themselves for the inevitable. "Good morning," Karen chirped, her voice dripping with false cheerfulness. "I've got a favor to ask." The protagonist's eyes narrowed, sensing the storm brewing. "What's going on?" Karen's eyes sparkled with an energy the protagonist recognized all too well, an energy that only came when she was about to spring some outlandish idea onto someone unsuspecting. "I'm getting married," Karen said, her tone casual as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "And I've decided to hold the ceremony at your barn." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The protagonist's jaw tightened. "No," they replied, firmly and without hesitation. But Karen wasn't deterred. She continued, her smile unwavering, as if the word no didn't even exist in her vocabulary. "Oh, but I've already talked to some of the guests, and it's all settled. Your barn is perfect for the rustic wedding theme I'm going for. It'll be charming and picturesque. Don't worry, we'll keep everything tidy, just a little ceremony, and then I'll have the place cleaned up afterward." The protagonist could feel their blood begin to boil. Every part of them screamed that this was wrong. Their barn wasn't meant for someone else's idea of a perfect day. It was their sanctuary, their personal space. The protagonist had always been generous when asked for help, but this was different. This was an invasion. But Karen didn't see it that way. "Karen, I'm sorry," the protagonist said, their voice sharp with the quiet strength that came from years of dealing with people like her. "You can't just use my property for your wedding. I'm not giving you permission." Karen's smile faltered for a split second, but then she laughed. A laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, come on. You'll see how lovely it is once it's done. It'll be good for you. Think of it as a bit of extra business. A lot of people will be here. It'll put your farm on the map." The protagonist stood their ground. "No, this isn't up for discussion." Karen's eyes flickered with something dark for just a moment. Annoyance, perhaps, but also something far more dangerous. She didn't like being told no, and she wasn't used to hearing it. "Oh, don't worry," Karen said, her voice suddenly cold. "I'll make sure everything goes according to plan. We'll make this happen one way or another." She turned on her heel and walked away, her heels clicking louder than ever. The protagonist stood there, staring after her, their gut tightening with the unmistakable feeling that this wasn't over. No, it had only just begun. Inside, a storm of frustration brewed. The protagonist had always kept their distance from Karen, knew that giving an inch meant losing a mile. But Karen's refusal to respect boundaries had crossed the line. The protagonist exhaled slowly, trying to calm their racing thoughts. They didn't want to make things worse. But the more they thought about it, the more the feeling in their gut told them they needed to act. There had to be a way to stop Karen from turning their peaceful life into a circus. Little did Karen know, the protagonist had a few tricks up their sleeve. And the barn wouldn't be her venue for a wedding, not without consequences. The first seed of a plan began to form. The protagonists smiled to themselves, And for the first time that day, the tension in their chest loosened. Karen was about to find out that not everyone was willing to be steamrolled. The game was on. The protagonist could feel the weight of Karen's words lingering in the air, like a storm on the horizon. It wasn't just the audacity of Karen's demand. It was the utter disrespect she had shown for their property, for their sanctuary. The barn wasn't just a building. It was the heart of the farm, a symbol of peace, a place of hard work and quiet moments. And now, Karen had decided that she was going to turn it into a wedding venue without even asking. It was too much for the protagonist to let slide. As the day passed, the protagonist found themselves pacing the small kitchen, eyes flicking over the darkening windows, the silence almost suffocating. The idea of confrontation gnawed at them, but it wasn't enough. Words alone wouldn't fix this. Karen needed to learn a lesson in respect. And if Karen thought the protagonist was going to back down, she was in for a rude awakening. The protagonist stood in the doorway, staring out at the barn. The setting sun cast long shadows across the fields, the golden light turning everything into a serene, almost otherworldly scene. But underneath that tranquility, a plan was brewing. An idea, wild and mischievous, taking root in the protagonist's mind. Goats. The farm's herd of goats was notorious for their mischief. They were clever, playful, and had an uncanny ability to find trouble. When it came to destruction, the goats could put a tornado to shame. The protagonist had often smiled at the chaos they caused, turned over flower pots, chewed through garden hoses, and even once managed to break into the kitchen and eat an entire loaf of bread. But today, those little troublemakers weren't just a source of amusement. Today, they were going to be the weapon. The protagonist walked toward the barn, their boots crunching in the gravel as they passed the empty pen. There were dozens of goats milling around, all content and unaware of the mischief they were about to participate in. The protagonist's eyes gleamed with a quiet determination. This was no longer about the wedding. It was about setting boundaries, about showing Karen that there were consequences to pushing too far. They started with the planning. There were subtle moves, tiny manipulations that would keep Karen's wedding from being anything but a disaster. The barn doors were left slightly ajar, the goats free to wander in. A few hay bales were left out, the perfect distraction. The pens were loosened, just enough to allow a curious goat or two to slip through without raising suspicion. Then, the final touch, the cake. Karen had made sure to mention that she'd hired a professional cake maker, a towering multi-tiered masterpiece that was supposed to be the highlight of the wedding. The protagonist's lips curled into a smile as they thought of how the goats would appreciate that cake more than anyone. As the evening approached, the protagonist worked quietly, gathering supplies and setting the scene for what was about to unfold. They knew Karen would likely show up early to start her wedding preparations, but by the time the first guest arrived, the goats would already be deep into their mission. The final task was to ensure the barn would be full of guests and full of goats. The protagonist worked quickly, feeding the animals and ushering them into the barn one by one, making sure they were positioned in just the right spots. The barn would soon be transformed into a chaotic, unpredictable battlefield. The protagonist stood back for a moment, admiring their handiwork. They had orchestrated this with care, but they couldn't deny that part of them was excited. It was the kind of controlled chaos that had always made life interesting on the farm. The protagonist paused, looking at the barn one last time before heading inside to prepare for the inevitable. Tonight, Karen would learn that there were consequences for disrespecting boundaries, and the goats were more than ready to make their point. The morning sun glinted off the barn's weathered roof as the protagonist stood in the shadow of the old oak tree, watching with a mix of curiosity and anticipation. The air was electric with the promise of chaos, and though the protagonist had planned everything with meticulous care, there was something deeply satisfying about seeing it all come to fruition. Karen, oblivious to the storm brewing just under the surface, was busy giving last-minute orders to her wedding planner and stringing up fairy lights inside the barn. The calm before the storm was almost unbearable. By the time Karen and her entourage of bridesmaids arrived, the stage was set. The goats, now fully in position, had already begun to stir within the barn. The protagonist made a final sweep through the area, checking the gates and ensuring everything was in place. Everything was ready. All that was left was for the wedding to begin. Karen stood at the barn's entrance, her smile wide and self-assured. She seemed completely convinced that nothing could possibly go wrong. "Everything's perfect," she muttered to herself, adjusting the hem of her dress and running a hand through her meticulously styled hair. She was oblivious to the impending disaster unfolding just a few feet behind her. As the first few guests began trickling into the barn, the tension in the air thickened. The protagonist watched from a distance, arms crossed, a small, almost satisfied smile tugging at the corners of their lips. Guests looked around in awe at the rustic charm of the barn, some nodding in approval at the decorations. Karen had certainly done her best to create a picturesque setting, but no one could see the disaster just beneath the surface. The barn was now a ticking time bomb, waiting to explode. And then it began. The first crash was almost imperceptible. A slight creak of the barn door followed by a quiet bleat. But before anyone could fully comprehend what was happening, a loud bam echoed through the barn as a goat slammed into a table, knocking over glasses of champagne. Guests shrieked in surprise, scrambling away from the tiny stampede that began unfolding in front of them. It started slow, but within moments, the barn was plunged into chaos. A second goat barreled through the crowd, its horns catching the edge of a decorative flower arch, tearing it to shreds as it rushed toward the cake table. Karen, looking absolutely horrified, froze in place as she watched her perfect wedding unravel before her eyes. The massive cake, glorious, multi-tiered, and crafted with precision, was reduced to a smeared mess as a goat decided it was the perfect snack. It took one mighty leap, landing on the cake with a grunt of satisfaction. Guests screamed as the goats, now fully unleashed, began to run riot. One goat darted toward the stage, knocking over a chair with a loud crash. Another made a beeline for the center of the barn, sending a table full of carefully placed wedding gifts flying in every direction. The bride's pristine white dress was torn as a goat, thinking it was a particularly tempting meal, yanked a piece of fabric with its teeth. The protagonist, standing just outside the barn, watched it all unfold with a twisted sense of satisfaction. Their plan was working far better than expected. Karen, her face flushed with fury, scrambled to regain control, but it was already too late. The barn had transformed from a serene rustic wedding venue to a chaotic zoo. "Get them out! Get them out!" Karen screeched, her voice rising to a pitch of pure panic. But no one knew how to catch the goats, who seemed to be enjoying every second of the madness. Guests scattered, some diving for cover behind tables, others trying to grab the goats with no success. The entire scene was a mad scramble of people, goats, and broken wedding decor. It wasn't just the goats that were causing havoc. The barn doors had swung wide open in the frenzy, and the goats began to make their escape into the wider farm. A herd of them charged past the wedding guests, scattering across the fields, while a few bold ones leaped over fences, making their way toward the garden. The bride stood frozen in disbelief, her eyes wide with shock. The wedding, once her dream day, had now become an unmitigated disaster. As the final goat trotted across the field, the protagonist, standing with their arms crossed, couldn't help but feel a rush of triumph. The barn, once a place of peaceful solitude, was now a war zone of wedding cake, torn dresses, and panicking guests. Karen had crossed the line, and now her perfect day was in tatters. The barn had turned into a circus, and Karen, who had once stood proudly at the entrance as a vision of bridal perfection, now appeared like a woman on the verge of collapse. Her wedding dress, once pristine, was now torn and caked in mud as she scrambled frantically between guests, shrieking for someone, anyone, to help. But the guests, now in full panic mode, were too busy dodging goats and running for cover. The protagonist stood just outside the chaos, savoring the sight of Karen's unraveling composure. The goats were in full control now, wild-eyed, nimble, and utterly unpredictable. One had knocked over a pillar of wedding gifts, sending a cascade of neatly wrapped boxes crashing to the floor. Another had discovered the open bar and was happily munching on napkins and straws. There was no stopping them. The barn was no longer a venue for a wedding. It was their playground. Inside the barn, the situation was rapidly deteriorating. Guests were climbing over tables to escape the goats, their heels clicking against the wooden floors as they dashed toward the exits. One bridesmaid, clutching her veil, shrieked as a goat brushed past her and knocked her to the ground. The guests, who had initially come for a celebration, were now part of the chaos. People were slipping on the spilled champagne, tripping over chairs, and getting caught in the frenzy of stampeding goats. Karen, her face flushed with anger, finally took charge. Sort of. She grabbed one of the nearest bridesmaids by the arm and hissed through gritted teeth, "You, go and get the goats. Get them out of here." But as she pointed toward the door, one particularly aggressive goat, a large brown one with striking horns, charged straight at her, sending Karen stumbling backward. "Out! Out! All of you!" Karen screamed, but the goats didn't seem to care. They were having too much fun. The protagonist watched, arms folded, with an almost eerie calmness as Karen's efforts became more and more desperate. It was a sight to behold. Karen, who thought she could just waltz in and commandeer the barn without a second thought, now reduced to a frantic mess, running in circles while the goats took full control of her day. There was a twisted satisfaction in knowing that this was exactly what she deserved. Just then, the chaos outside the barn escalated. The barn doors, still wide open, had allowed several goats to break free. The protagonist knew this moment was coming. One particularly stubborn goat, affectionately known as Big Earl, had figured out how to open the gate, and now he was leading a small herd across the fields. The guests who had initially tried to hide inside the barn were now running out into the open, desperate to avoid being trampled. Karen, eyes wide with disbelief, rushed to the door and attempted to block the goats from escaping, but it was no use. Big Earl, with his beady eyes and heavy hooves, came charging toward her with a force that sent her flying backward into the mud. The guests shrieked again as the massive goat galloped across the yard, leading the rest of the herd on a wild chase around the property. Karen's screams echoed through the farm, her voice high-pitched with panic. Somebody, stop them. Somebody help. But no one was listening. The protagonist, with a quiet chuckle, watched the scene unfold with amusement. The goats were free, and no one could catch them. Not now. Suddenly, the reality of the situation hit Karen. Her dream wedding was in ruins. Guests were gone, her dress was ruined, and the barn had been overrun by goats. Her guests were now involved in a wild chase, some of them chasing after the goats, others scrambling to salvage what they could. The cake, once the centerpiece of her perfect day, was a mangled mess of frosting and hooves. The flowers were trampled. The photographer, trying to salvage some semblance of order, had his camera knocked out of his hands by a goat who decided the lens looked particularly delicious. Karen, breathing heavily, turned and locked eyes with the protagonist from across the chaos. For a fleeting moment, there was a silence, an understanding. She was finally seeing the consequences of her actions, the reality of pushing too hard. The protagonist, arms still crossed, watched the destruction with a detached calmness. Karen's face twisted in rage, and for a moment, it seemed like she might charge at them. But instead, she sank to her knees in the mud, hands clasped together as if she were praying for a miracle. Her wedding, the one she demanded, was completely and utterly destroyed. The protagonist felt a brief pang of something, but it wasn't pity. It was something closer to satisfaction. But as Karen's sobs filled the air, the protagonist realized one thing. The game wasn't quite over. The goats were still out there, causing chaos, and the lesson was still incomplete. Karen wasn't the only one who needed to learn something from this disaster. The protagonist turned slowly, their eyes glinting with a quiet determination. The goats weren't done yet, and neither was the lesson. Karen's cries echoed through the farm, a stark contrast to the once peaceful setting. The barn, once a place of promise, had now become a war zone. Guests were scattered across the fields like startled animals, some clambering over fences, others waving their hands in a futile attempt to herd the goats back into the barn. The protagonist, standing just outside the madness, allowed themselves a moment of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just the goats that had taken over. It was the complete unraveling of Karen's perfect day, a day she tried so desperately to force into existence. The goats, their mission of mayhem complete for the moment, had settled into the field. Some were nibbling grass, others were contentedly lying down, oblivious to the chaos they'd left behind. Big Earl, the ringleader, had found a shady spot under the oak tree and lay there with a smug look, as if he knew he was the true star of the show. Inside the barn, the once elegant decor had been reduced to ruins. The cake was nothing more than a heap of frosting and broken cake stands, now serving as a new playground for the younger goats. The floral arrangements had been scattered and trampled underfoot, and the expensive champagne was now a sticky puddle on the floor. The guests, some still covered in mud and cake remnants, were trying to regroup, some standing awkwardly in the corners, others gossiping in hushed tones. Karen, meanwhile, was having a meltdown. She stood in the middle of the wreckage, tears streaking down her face as she glared at the protagonist from across the room. Her voice, once confident and commanding, was now high-pitched and trembling with anger. "You did this. You ruined everything," she screamed, her hands balled into fists at her sides. The protagonist stood still, unfazed by Karen's fury. They had anticipated this moment, the inevitable confrontation. Karen had pushed too far, assuming her way would prevail. Now, the full weight of the consequences had crashed down on her, and all the protagonist had to do was watch her scramble to recover what was already lost. "I told you, Karen," the protagonist said calmly, their voice cutting through the anger. "I told you this wasn't your place. This barn, this land, it's mine. You don't get to take it over just because you decided it was perfect for your little wedding fantasy." Karen's hands shook as she looked around the wreckage. This was supposed to be my dream wedding. I was going to make it perfect. And now, look at it. You've ruined everything. The protagonist's lips twitched into a faint smile, but they didn't respond right away. Karen's words were laced with desperation, but the protagonist saw through them. This wasn't about the wedding anymore. It was about control. Karen had tried to take what wasn't hers, and now she was paying the price. "You don't understand," Karen sobbed, her eyes wild with rage. "You can't just let me ruin my day. You can't. This is supposed to be my day." The protagonist stepped forward, their tone cool but firm. "It wasn't your day to ruin, Karen. It was never your day. You didn't even ask for permission. You just assumed you could have whatever you wanted." The words stung, and Karen's face twisted in fury. She was about to speak again, but before she could, the sound of frantic footsteps echoed behind them. A guest, breathless and wide-eyed, burst into the barn. "You've got to stop them," she gasped. "The goats. They've gotten into the garden. They're eating everything." The protagonist's eyes glinted with a flash of amusement. Karen, however, turned pale. "No, not the garden. No, no, no." It was as though the world itself was aligning against her, as if the very universe were determined to teach Karen the lesson she had so boldly ignored. The protagonist, resisting the urge to grin, turned to face Karen. "Looks like your day isn't over yet." The twist. Outside, the goats had begun to wreak havoc in the garden, trampling through carefully cultivated rows of flowers and nibbling at the expensive vegetables that had taken months to grow. The once beautiful garden, the pride of the farm, was now a grazing field for goats who hadn't known the meaning of boundaries. But the real kicker, the garden wasn't just a source of pride. It was where Karen had planned her picture-perfect wedding photos. The backdrop, the flowers, the carefully selected plants. Everything had been designed for the perfect Instagram-worthy shot. And now, as the goats turned it into their personal buffet, the damage to Karen's carefully curated dream was irreparable. The protagonist watched from the barn door as the chaos unfolded in the garden. Guests, now returning from their frantic attempts to corral the goats, were pointing and gasping in disbelief. It wasn't just the wedding that was ruined, it was Karen's entire vision of perfection. Everything she had meticulously planned, every detail she had carefully orchestrated, had now been obliterated. A bitter silence hung in the air as Karen stood frozen in place, her mouth open in disbelief. "You'll have to tell your photographer to cancel the session," the protagonist called to her. "I don't think those goats will be giving you much of a backdrop for your perfect wedding photos anymore." Karen turned to face them, her eyes wide with panic. It was no longer just anger. This was a deep, visceral panic. She had no control. She had lost everything. And it was all because of one simple mistake, thinking she could take without asking, assuming her wants mattered more than anything else. The protagonist turned away, a faint smirk playing at the corners of their lips. The lesson had been taught, but the best part, it wasn't over yet. The garden was no longer recognizable. Where vibrant flowers had once bloomed in neat rows, there were only chewed stumps and broken stems. The goats, now fully indulging in their free-for-all feast, had turned the once pristine landscape into an unrecognizable patchwork of destruction. The protagonist, standing at the edge of the barn, watched as Karen stood motionless, her eyes wide in disbelief, unable to process the magnitude of the disaster before her. The guests, those who hadn't yet fled in panic, now stood at the far edges of the garden, murmuring in hushed tones, their expressions a mix of disbelief and bewilderment. A few had tried to stop the goats, waving their hands, shouting, even throwing sticks, but the goats seemed completely unaffected, content to munch away as if they had all the time in the world. Karen, her fists clenched at her sides, looked like she might break into tears or lash out at the nearest person, her voice trembling with fury. This can't be happening," she shouted, her face red with rage. "Everything's ruined. My wedding, my perfect day. Everything." The protagonist, calm and collected, took a slow step forward, their boots crunching against the gravel. "Well, Karen," they said, their voice smooth and steady, "you should have thought about that before you decided to take over my barn without asking." The words landed like a cold slap, and Karen's face twisted in fury. "You're insane. This was supposed to be my special day. Why are you doing this?" The protagonist gave a slow shrug, as if the whole thing was hardly worth the effort. "You've made it very clear today that you don't respect boundaries. I'm just teaching you what happens when people push too far." Karen's eyes were filled with venom now. "I'll make sure you regret this. You can't just ruin someone's wedding and get away with it." The protagonist raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Oh, and what are you going to do about it, Karen? There's nothing left to save. You might as well take this as a lesson." It was then that the protagonist heard the faint sound of hooves behind them. They turned just in time to see Big Earl, the biggest of the goats, sauntering up to the barn door. The massive creature, whose earlier antics had caused so much chaos, seemed unbothered by the panic around him. His eyes gleamed with an almost knowing look as he wandered past the protagonist, toward the newly destroyed garden. And then, something even more unexpected happened. A loud crash followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering made everyone jump. The barn's back door, the one that had been left slightly ajar for the goats to roam through, suddenly exploded with noise. One of the goats, a small but particularly daring one, had found its way into the barn's storage area. where a stack of unused wedding decorations had been kept for an emergency. Now those decorations, ornate glass vases, expensive candles, and fragile flower arrangements, were flying through the air like a tornado of shattering glass and broken porcelain. The guests who were still trying to salvage some semblance of dignity were now thrown into full-on panic mode. One woman, trying to avoid a collision with a goat, tripped and tumbled into a stack of chairs, sending them crashing down like dominoes. Laughter, though clearly tinged with madness, rippled through the remaining onlookers. Some guests had given up entirely and were retreating toward their cars, unable to deal with any more of the absurdity. Karen, her face twitching with a mixture of disbelief and rage, turned on the protagonist again. "Why are you doing this to me? Why can't you just let me have one thing? One day?" The protagonist paused, taking in her frustration. They knew Karen didn't get it. Not yet, anyway. The moment was almost too perfect, the stakes too high. They had taken something she had assumed would be effortless and turned it into a lesson, a burning example of what happens when you assume entitlement. "You never asked for permission, Karen," the protagonist said, voice laced with quiet menace. "You came here, into my space, and you assumed you could do whatever you wanted. You pushed too far, and now you're paying the price." As if to punctuate the point, a goat, one that had mysteriously disappeared earlier, now reappeared in the garden, bounding over the fence with ease. This time, however, it had a new target: the pile of wedding gifts. A loud crash rang out as the goat bounded straight into the pile, knocking over a carefully wrapped box and sending it tumbling down a small hill. It wasn't enough to be a mere annoyance. This was destruction at its finest. Karen's eyes locked onto the scene with a hollow, defeated look. There was nothing left to do, nothing left to save. Her dream wedding, everything she had worked so hard to control, had fallen apart completely. Her dress, once a symbol of grace, was now a filthy mess of mud and cake frosting. The cake itself, no longer a towering masterpiece, was nothing more than a pile of crushed cake and disheveled frosting, surrounded by curious goats. The guests who hadn't left in terror were staring, some of them unsure whether to laugh or cry. And then, as if it were the final nail in the coffin, Big Earl, the leader of the goats, strolled calmly into the wreckage of the garden and gave a triumphant bleat. It was the final confirmation. Karen's perfect day was no more. The protagonist glanced back at Karen, watching as her shoulders slumped in utter defeat. For a brief moment, the chaos seemed to subside. In that silence, there was an undeniable truth. Karen had learned her lesson, albeit the hard way. The protagonist turned to leave, the sound of their boots fading into the distance. As they walked away from the wreckage, they couldn't help but smile. The lesson had been taught, and it had been taught perfectly. Karen stood frozen in the middle of the wreckage, her once pristine wedding dress caked in mud and frosting, her face pale and streaked with tears. The chaos around her seemed to slow, each moment stretching painfully, as if the world was daring her to accept the finality of what had happened. The garden, once a canvas of carefully curated flowers and lush greenery, was now a mess of uprooted plants, gnawed stems, and scattered debris. The goats, content in their reign of destruction, wandered aimlessly, chewing on whatever they could find. The once proud barn was now a place of shattered glass and broken dreams. And through it all, the protagonists stood just outside the madness, their eyes glinting with quiet satisfaction. They could feel the weight of the moment, the end of Karen's self-perceived perfect day. The final act had arrived. Why? Karen's voice was barely a whisper, cracked and desperate. "Why are you doing this to me?" The question hung in the air like a lifeline she hoped would save her, but the protagonist's response was cold, measured. "Because you thought you could take something that wasn't yours. You didn't even ask for permission. You assumed that your wants were all that mattered." Her body trembled as if trying to hold back the storm inside her, but Karen couldn't stop the words from pouring out. I worked so hard for this day. This was supposed to be my moment. I'm the one who deserves it. Why did you ruin it? Why couldn't you just leave me alone?" Her voice cracked on the last words, and in that moment, the protagonist almost felt a flicker of something like pity. But it was fleeting, replaced once again by the sharp edge of resolve. Karen had crossed the line the moment she decided that the world revolved around her. The barn was more than just a space. It was the culmination of years of work, care, and respect for the land. To let someone like Karen think she could just waltz in and claim it as her own was an insult. "You didn't listen," the protagonist replied, their voice unwavering. "And that's the problem. People like you don't realize that the world doesn't bend to your will just because you think you deserve it." The words hit Karen like a blow. She staggered back, her face contorting with a mixture of anger, confusion, and heartbreak. She opened her mouth to retort, but instead, her eyes flicked to something behind the protagonist. The faintest noise had caught her attention, the sound of hooves clipping against the ground. Big Earl, the leader of the goats, was at it again. He had wandered away from the wreckage of the garden and was now moving toward the barn's back door. With a sudden, bold motion, he pushed open the door with his head and entered the barn once more, where the decorations had already been destroyed. And that's when it happened. The final, unmistakable moment of reckoning. Big Earl, with his characteristic confidence, walked up to the pile of wedding gifts, completely oblivious to the damage they had already caused. His hooves clattered against the delicate wrapped boxes, sending one toppling to the ground. But the goat wasn't content with just knocking things over. He lunged for the pile, his large mouth grabbing hold of the topmost box. With a single powerful tug, he ripped the ribbon clean off, tearing through the wrapping paper like it was nothing. Karen's breath caught in her throat, her eyes locking onto the scene, as if her mind couldn't fully comprehend the sheer audacity of it. Big Earl, seemingly as vindictive as the protagonist had felt, had made his move. In a few swift seconds, the entire pile of wedding gifts was in chaos. The expensive boxes, the careful wrapping, gone. The expensive china that had been carefully selected as a gift for the newlyweds was being devoured by the relentless goat, its horns knocking over anything that dared to get in its way. Karen's face twisted, her hands flying up to cover her mouth in horror. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound caught in her throat. The guests, some still hiding behind fences or sitting in their cars, had no words either. The absurdity of the situation was too much to grasp, and yet it was happening in front of their eyes, like some twisted comedy unfolding in real time. The protagonist could feel the moment stretch out. The gift pile, now a war zone, was a perfect metaphor for everything Karen had tried to control. The more she fought to hold on to perfection, the more it slipped through her fingers, just like the pile of gifts now being trampled underfoot. Karen, face drained of color, slowly sank to her knees in the mud. Her arms fell to her sides as she stared helplessly at the wreckage. She had no more fight left in her, no more excuses. And in that moment, the protagonist realized something profound. It wasn't just about teaching Karen a lesson. It was about reclaiming the balance, showing her that control comes from respect, not entitlement. The goats, in their chaotic freedom, had become the perfect agents of this lesson. The protagonist turned away, their gaze lingering on Karen one last time. The storm was over. The chaos had reached its peak, but there was something more in the air now, an eerie calm, a moment where everything had come to an undeniable end. The protagonist's footsteps faded into the distance, the sound of hooves behind them growing quieter as the day's drama finally reached its conclusion. Karen, on her knees in the mud, was left to face the full extent of her own actions. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the wreckage of what had once been Karen's perfect wedding. The barn, now a ghost of its former self, stood solemn and silent, a shell of the dream it had once been meant to house. The garden, where the goats had feasted, was a barren wasteland, the flowers no longer visible beneath the trampling hooves. The expensive wedding decorations, once meticulously arranged, were now nothing but scattered remnants of an unrealized fantasy. The air still smelled faintly of crushed cake, mixed with the earthy scent of damp hay and grass. Karen remained on her knees in the mud, her face a pale mask of disbelief. Her wedding dress, now torn and smeared with dirt, clung to her frame as if it were a symbol of the illusion she'd so desperately tried to maintain. She stared blankly at the ruined pile of wedding gifts, Big Earl and his herd having done their final bit of destruction. There was nothing left but debris and the sound of distant hooves as the goats, having done their work, wandered lazily into the twilight. For a long moment, the only sound that could be heard was the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. The protagonist, standing at the edge of the chaos, observed Karen with a strange mixture of pity and finality. It wasn't a moment of triumph for them, but more the inevitable end of something that had never had a chance to begin. There had been no malice in their actions, only the quiet understanding that some lessons had to be learned the hard way. "Is it over?" Karen's voice broke the silence, her words barely more than a whisper. She wasn't speaking to the protagonist. She was speaking to herself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Is this really how it ends? The protagonist turned slowly, locking eyes with Karen. "You didn't leave me much choice," they said, their tone low but resolute. "You thought you could take everything, my barn, my space, my boundaries, and make it your own. There's no such thing as a perfect day when you ignore the people around you, Karen." Her eyes flashed with the remnants of defiance, but it was hollow now, like a spark that would never catch. I don't deserve this," she stammered, looking around at the wreckage. "All I wanted was one thing, one day of happiness." The protagonist stepped closer, their boots crunching against the gravel. They watched her struggle, the weight of her own desires slowly sinking in. "Happiness is built on respect," they said simply. "It's not about grand gestures or perfect weddings. It's about understanding your place, your impact on others." Karen's shoulders slumped, her hands falling limply to her sides. For a moment, she looked every bit like a broken doll, her pride shattered beyond repair. There was no one left to blame, no excuses that could make this any better. She had overstepped, and the world had pushed back in a way that was as sudden as it was final. The protagonist paused, looking at the barn and the land beyond. "You'll never have this again. Not here. Not after what you've done. But you still have time. Time to understand. Time to fix the things you've broken." Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her gaze shifted to the scattered gifts, the empty bottles of champagne, the smashed cake, and finally the goats who were now peacefully grazing in the fading light. The goats had been the agents of destruction, but now they seemed strangely content, as if everything had unfolded exactly as it was meant to. The protagonist took a long, steadying breath. "I think we're done here," they said, turning to walk away. "You know where the road leads from here, Karen. You'll figure it out." And just like that, the protagonist was gone, leaving Karen behind in the ruins of her expectations. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows across the field. The goats, oblivious to the weight of the day's events, continued their grazing, each one lost in its own quiet world. The distant sound of a car engine starting echoed faintly from the driveway, signaling the last few guests who had decided to leave, their presence no longer necessary. And Karen, left alone in the aftermath of her own choices, finally understood what the protagonist had meant. She had been so focused on her perfect day, her perfect dream, that she had forgotten the simple truth. You can't take something that isn't yours without consequences. And now, there would be no perfect wedding, no fairy tale, only the long, hard road of facing the reality she had tried to escape. With a final, ragged breath, Karen looked around one last time. She was alone. The protagonist had vanished. The goats were still grazing, and the once beautiful barn was now an empty shell of its former glory. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. The ending twist. As Karen stood alone in the wreckage, her heart heavy with the weight of her failure. Something unexpected happened. A small goat, the one that had been particularly curious about the wedding gifts, trotted over to her. It stopped at her feet, bleated softly, and then nudged her gently with its nose. Karen looked down, her heart clenching in a strange mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. The goat, as if sensing the weight of the moment, nuzzled her again, its large brown eyes wide and unblinking. In that strange, quiet moment, Karen felt something shift inside her. An understanding, perhaps, or the tiniest glimmer of peace. She bent down slowly, her hands trembling, and reached out to pet the little goat. It felt oddly comforting, like a sign of forgiveness in the midst of chaos. Maybe, just maybe, there was hope for her yet. And with that final touch, the story came to a close, leaving Karen alone, but not without a lesson learned, perhaps not fully, but enough to start the journey toward understanding.